Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. You're watching Alaska Weather. Thank you for joining us on this 21st of November. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information at 1-800-472-0391. That's the Alaska Weather Information Line. And you can always find us online at weather.gov/Alaska. And if you have any questions about what you're finding or you can't seem to find what you need, please let me know, and I'm happy to steer you in the right direction. david.snider@noaa.gov is the place you can find me with email. Let's take a look at the warnings and watches and advisories across Alaska. Of course, we know northwestern Alaska is still taking it on the chin with winter weather. We'll get there in just a moment, but first, a late edition is the snow advisory, or winter weather advisory for Juneau. For 4 to 6 inches of snow, it looks like. That'll start up at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, so another round of snow is headed your way with the storm that's well to your south. It looks like that trough of low pressure is going to move into the region and make possible at least 4 to 6 inches of snow. There may be a few places that get a little bit more. There's certainly a possibility there's going to be some rain and snow a little bit further to the west down toward Dehne and Gustavus. So pay attention to the weather tomorrow. 9 o'clock is when we expect to start to see some accumulations in the region. So again, a snow advisory for the Juneau area tomorrow. Now look up to the north and west, and we are still looking at blizzard warnings all the way down through Norton Sound, the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound, the Brooks Range, and the Chukchi Coast. And we're talking about 4 to 8 inches of snow in many locations there, as well as poor visibility, and with the gusty winds continuing throughout the period there. A lot of this will wind up as we go into Wednesday morning from west to east and probably start to ramp down as we get into the mid to late afternoon hours across the eastern Brooks Range. So many locations here will continue to see blizzard conditions through tonight and through at least early tomorrow morning before conditions start to settle out and improve during the daytime tomorrow. So again, be prepared for poor visibility and the ability to lose your way if you step outside. Just be very careful out there. Make sure that you have a plan with someone. Let them know that you're coming if you must travel. And if you don't have to, maybe tonight and tomorrow will be a good time to take it easy and just stay put where you are. Now, some locations here across Norton Sound, all the way down the Yukon Delta and into Bristol Bay, are also looking at coastal flood advisories. And some places may see as much as 4 to 8 feet of a surge across the region. We're also talking about some high winds around the Pribilofs. As we look a little bit further south, high wind warnings are in effect there. Coastal flood advisories are in effect for the south and western coast, as well as winter weather advisories. It looks like there will be a decent burst of rain and snow pushing into the region. A lot of that, though, will be mitigated by some warmer air coming right up against the coast. So there will be some areas that see a decent amount of snow coming down fairly quickly, and some of that may be rain right along the coast because of the warm air coming right along behind it. So high wind warnings up north around St. Lawrence Island. There were gusts up to 80 miles per hour. We've got high wind warnings down around the Pribilofs, and we have a high wind watch now for the Alaska Peninsula. We expect that those winds could reach upwards of 65 miles per hour. That would be a little bit more toward Thursday. So the high winds are shifting southward as that frontal boundary works ashore from west to east. So an awful lot going on. Snow and wind in the north. High winds a little bit further south, along with a push of water coming in across the west coast, and more high winds as you get down to the south, and of course snow possible in Juneau as we get into the day. Here's a look at the satellite picture over the last 12 hours or so. You can see the moisture coming up through southeastern Alaska. This is the system that is going to put a half foot of snow around the capital city here as we get started tomorrow, again around 9 o'clock. One wave of moisture is moving through. This likely will add some snow to south central as we get through tonight, but this is really the big weather maker up north with a very expansive area of low pressure across the Chukchi Coast. As that moves from west to east, you can see the cold air wrapping in behind it as well. Those bright white areas of clouds indicating a much better chance of snow production there. A little bit of a break, and then we get back into those stronger west and northwesterly winds that are affecting the St. Lawrence area, the western coast, and the Pribilofs as we go into tonight. The next round of weather is coming in behind that, and you can see that across the western Bering. The clouds rapidly filling in what was somewhat drier air earlier today will turn back into snow and wind as we get into the next 24 hours or so. In the meantime, Juneau again getting prepared to see an opportunity for snow once again. Now, as we get into the map time today, high pressure sitting across western Canada, 1,032 millibars, feeding in plenty of cold and southerly winds into a large part of the Brooks Range. Snow and blowing snow reported all the way across the Chukchi coast. Low pressures down to 969 millibars. Blizzard conditions continue in many locations there. So again, travel's not advised at this point. Across the Yukon Delta, snow and blowing snow all the way up into the middle Yukon. Low pressure moving in across Bristol Bay, another area of weak weather there across the northern Gulf at 1,008 millibars, and the low that's across the eastern Gulf sitting at 985 millibars. This is tracking northward and again should help to produce a better chance of snow there. You can just barely see the beginnings of the next weather maker out west. That's quickly going to take place in the Bering Sea at 984 millibars. The current low still up across the Chukchi coast as we head through tonight. High pressure moving out of the way, low pressure moving north towards southeast, and this big weather maker out west will start to really focus in on the west coast once again with another surge of wind and waves across many of our coastal communities there from the Yukon Delta north into Norton Sound and the Bering Sea. For Wednesday, a 969 millibar low north and west of Nunivak Island and north of the Pribilofs. And look at the very sharp boundary here. This front quickly moving ashore means areas inland will be looking at snow and blowing snow, blizzard conditions all the way up into the Seward Peninsula, but a very sharp contrast here between what could be poor visibility and snow to just a very windy rain. So coastal communities again may be right there on the edge of seeing some snow and really rough conditions or just a rainy day. Hopefully it's the rain, but considering how fast this is moving, you may get a little bit of both. Across the interior, periods of snow all the way through the Tanana Valley and northward. The windiest conditions start to move away from the Brooks Range. This may take a large part of the day to clear out of the way, but then we start to focus on the snow for southeast, and you can see snow sitting right across the northern parts of the Panhandle as we get into the afternoon, kind of a daytime snow event, as it were. As you look out to the west, a very tight pressure gradient across the Bering Sea. You know there's going to be some big waves out there, and also across the eastern chain. The Alaska Peninsula, though, seems to be the place where we'll get some of the highest winds and a high wind watch in effect for your Thursday as that pressure gradient tightens up even more across the eastern chain and the Alaska Peninsula. Low pressure drops to 978 millibars. Warmer air spreads into southeast. That looks like a little bit more of a rain and snow setup for you, but still breezy at times. So the strongest winds will be out across the west, and the pressure gradient is also fairly tight across southwestern Alaska and Bristol Bay, as well as western Alaska Range passes and even south central. High pressure setting up across the upper Yukon at 1,002 millibars. The pressure gradient relaxes a little bit more across the north. That means a little less wind for some of our northwestern villages, but it still looks like it's going to snow across your region. So it looks like the weather will still be working over a large part of west and northwestern Alaska through the end of the week. So stay on your guard and be prepared and hunker down if you can. Out across the west, a 1,042 millibar high tries to move in across the central chain toward the end of the week. Let's take a look at temperatures quickly. Across the interior, lows down into the 20 to 30 below range for the central and eastern interior thanks to the high across western Canada. Cold stuff for the north, but you can see the impacts of that very wet air coming in across the west. Lows only in the teens and 20s for the west coast. Savunga down to 29. Southeast, teens and 20s for many areas, and south of Sitka, out toward Petersburg, Wrangell, you're looking at lows in the lower 30s. South central, single digits again tonight. Kodiak near 30. A high tomorrow, about 2 in Fairbanks, 9 in Barrow, 24 in Kotzebue, 32 in Nome, southwest, upper 20s and lower 30s, Kodiak 33, Dutch Harbor and Unalaska, mid 40s for you, 40 in St. Paul and a windy day there, 30s and 40s for southeast. Lows Thursday morning in the anywhere from 5 to 10 below around Fairbanks, 6 above in Barrow, 23 in Nome, up to 38 in St. Paul, southwest, Kodiak, Bristol Bay, and Dillingham in the teens and 20s, south central in the low teens, southeast, 20s, coastal areas in the 30s with highs on Thursday. A little warmer across the eastern interior, anywhere from 5 below to 5 above. Teens for the north, 32 in Nome. Bethel, you're looking at 26, south central back in the upper teens, and 35 in Kodiak.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to flying weather now. You can see widespread IFR across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and into the middle and upper Yukon Valley and the Tanana Valley as we start your Wednesday morning. Out west, a next wave of weather moving across the Bering Sea will create IFR in the morning for the central chain and lingering MVFR across southern sections of southeast. That will expand a little bit northward as we get into the afternoon. Across the Yukon Valley, expect widespread MVFR as we get through your Wednesday and across the Chukchi Coast. IFR lingers across the south-facing slopes of the western Brooks Range for Wednesday afternoon, and another wave of IFR extends into south and western parts of the Yukon Valley as well as parts of the southwestern coast for Wednesday afternoon. So we get into Thursday morning, MVFR really takes over most of the north coast as well as the Yukon Valley. Southwest dealing with widespread IFR for your Thursday. MVFR conditions for the central and southern sections of the Panhandle and some improvement across the central and western parts of the chain. By the afternoon, though, we're still watching for IFR across the lingering Gulf Coast storm. MVFR conditions for southeast and many areas in south central's Prince William Sound and the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula. By and large, the Copper River Valley, Cook Inlet, and the western Alaska Range passes should be okay, with IFR continuing across the north slope, north of the Brooks Range, and a large part of the Beaufort Seacoast, and hit-and-miss spots along the upper Yukon Valley for your Thursday afternoon. On to your past conditions then for tomorrow. AKwx looks to hold around IFR. There may be some improvement by the afternoon, but the majority of the day seems to be close to IFR, and the same goes for Adigan Pass for your Wednesday. As we get into Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, expect IFR conditions in the morning, but improvement should be had by the afternoon, so if you can wait just a little bit, might be a good idea. Rainy Pass starts out around MVFR with improvements during the day toward VFR conditions for Wednesday. Windy Pass probably holds around MVFR conditions through most of the day. Isabel Pass also expected to stay around MVFR. Antasta Pass starting around IFR in the morning with some notable improvements by the afternoon. So again, might be a good time to wait and hold off just a little bit. Tanita Pass starting out at MVFR with improvements during the afternoon. Porter's Pass looks pretty good really through most of the day. You'll see a few more issues though as you get into your Thursday. And Chilkoot and White Pass right now looking A-OK both really Wednesday and Thursday so far. Here's a look at the freezing levels now, and you'll notice that the surface freezing line is up through the Bering Strait, north of St. Lawrence Island and Nunivak Island, taking a dip over over Kodiak Island and a large part of Bristol Bay, and then hovering right over southeast. The freezing levels aloft anywhere from 2 to 10,000 feet across the western Bering and the central Aleutian chain, and across southeast anywhere from 2 to about 8,000 feet. You'll notice levels there over the Haida Gwaii region around 8,000 feet and up around the capital city and just south around 2,000 feet for your Wednesday. Icing potential is fairly widespread, but it seems to be lingering around isolated moderate in most areas. You'll see levels anywhere above 2,000 feet in the north to about 2 to as high as 10,000 feet across the Bering Sea as that warmer air moves in once again, and 2 to 6,000 feet across a large part of eastern and southeastern Alaska. Over Bristol Bay, the southern end of the Cook Inlet region and Kodiak Island, levels could start out around 4,000 feet for your Wednesday. Here's a jet stream, and a large trough dominates the Gulf and the eastern parts of the northern Pacific. With that, we see some very strong winds coming into the Pacific Northwest, but this is creating that unsettled weather across southeast and a large part of eastern Alaska. The fastest moving winds across the North Pacific running around 125 to 160 knots just north of high pressure, and the powerful cold coming in off of eastern Asia is running in from the west around 95 knots with some additional speed maxes here across northern parts of Alaska, anywhere from 60 to about 120 knots. At 9,000 feet, you can see low pressure around Haida Gwaii, also just south of St. Lawrence Island and over St. Matthew. Winds to the west and south of that are running from 40 to 60 knots with more of a south and westerly flow coming into Bristol Bay and northerlies coming into the eastern parts of the Gulf. Westerlies continue across the Brooks Range, 25 to 30 knots there for Wednesday. And low pressure continues to help winds up a little bit to the north with high pressure a little bit further to the east. That's keeping more of a southerly flow just out of northern sections of Alaska. As we get into 3,000 feet, you'll notice that broad south and westerly flow. We've got wraparound flow here to weak low pressure across the northern Gulf, northwesterlies across the Gulf itself, and wind speeds around 50 to 70 knots or so across the YK Delta, westerlies over the Brooks Range, and winds coming into south central between 25 and 40 knots, with the chain looking at wind speeds from 30 to 45. As you get into turbulence, we expect most of the issues will be across western and northern Alaska below 4,000 to 6,000 feet. Southwestern Alaska dealing with levels below 4,000 feet, most of that reaching into considerable moderate, including Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island. We'll be back with a look at your marines in just a moment.
Any sound in a normally quiet area will seem louder than it would in a noisy environment. Now, given what we know about how noise is generated by airplanes and how it's perceived by people on the ground, we can make one simple observation. If we're flying an airplane with a constant speed prop, reducing RPM is the single most effective thing we can do to reduce noise. And if we're flying a fixed pitch prop, greater altitude and lateral separation is our most effective tactic. With that understanding, let's look at strategies for reducing noise in the airport environment. And let's begin with the takeoff. Some airports seem to attract residential development the way mobile homes attract tornadoes. It's important to select a run-up location as far from houses as possible. For the same reason, if you have a choice, use a runway located as far from noise-sensitive neighborhoods as possible. Even if it weren't a good idea, for safety reasons, avoiding intersection takeoffs helps us reduce our noise signature. Using the full length of a runway allows us to gain the maximum amount of altitude before we cross the airport boundary and fly over nearby homes. Using the best angle of climb speed will net us the greatest altitude gain for the distance traveled. If this makes you uncomfortable, stick with the best rate of climb speed for your climb out. We'll retract our landing gear as soon as we have established a positive rate of climb and can no longer land on the remaining runway. That reduces drag, which again allows us to leave the airport environment with the greatest altitude gain. As we approach the airport boundary, and certainly before we fly over any residential areas, we'll reduce power to the cruise climb power setting. This will slow the prop as much as safely possible. Your pilot's operating handbook or airplane flight manual will provide you with acceptable cruise climb power settings. You may be surprised at how slowly you can safely turn that propeller. Many pilots don't realize that operating over square, that is, at a higher manifold pressure than prop RPM, is perfectly permissible in most airplanes. And remember also to make your power reduction as smoothly as possible to reduce those abrupt attention-getting sounds. Let's apply these suggestions to an average A36 Bonanza and see the difference in noise created at the departure end of the runway. First, a typical high-power, low-rate of climb departure. Now let's compare that to a best rate of climb departure with a power reduction to the cruise climb setting. As you can see, this simple change in procedure yielded a 5 dB reduction in noise at the airport boundary. The route we choose for our departure is very important. Our first choice would be any noise abatement procedure established for the runway we're using. Where none are published, I often ask the FBO or airport management about the best departure plan. At controlled airports, ATC instructions override noise abatement procedures. But I've usually found that traffic and weather permitting, controllers will allow me to use departure routes that help me avoid noise-sensitive neighborhoods. If no noise abatement procedures have been established, we'll rely on common sense to choose a departure path. We'll try to climb out over industrial areas or interstate highways where will be the quietest activity around. Airports hemmed in by development pose a special challenge. Sometimes the best you can do is just head for the least populated areas at the highest possible altitude, of course. Flight instructors are particularly important in the effort to reduce perceived aircraft noise. Repetitive activities like touch and goes and practice instrument approaches are best performed at rural airports wherever possible. Simulated engine failures should not be done in areas where the roar of the engine coming back to life will be particularly annoying to people on the ground. Ground reference maneuvers such as turns around a point should be practiced in the least densely populated areas available to you. Arriving at our destination, it's again important for us to know and use any established noise abatement procedure. Beyond that, remember the basic guidelines. Stay as high as possible, keep the prop as slow as possible, and fly patterns as close to the runway as possible. Some pilots fly an unnecessarily wide, long pattern. This not only takes them out over residential areas at relatively low altitude, it doesn't leave many options in the event of a power loss. Whenever possible, maintain pattern altitude until turning onto the base leg. This is particularly beneficial from the noise standpoint when you have to extend the downwind leg for any reason. Some pilots also allow themselves to get too low, too far out. Then they have to drag the airplane up to the runway with power. The folks living underneath this experiment in pitch and power probably won't appreciate the demonstration. Remember that flaps are used to slow down and go down. It just doesn't make sense to get any draggier than necessary in the pattern and then have to add power to reach the runway. Clean, stable, low power, low drag approaches are significantly quieter approaches. On final, stay at or above the VASI and don't advance the propeller control until you've made your final power reduction.
And now, marine weather around Alaska. Time for a quick check of your sea ice edge, and the Beaufort Sea is really filled in. It looks like in the last couple days a lot of this has closed off. Still notably not closed off is the Chukchi Sea, and that's the reason that some of these storms are really battering the west coast. Some areas in the upper inlets there, in Norton Sound, Kotzebue Sound, are seeing some more substantial ice in the upper ends there, and there's plenty of coastal ice spreading down into the YK Delta region. So plenty more information anytime you want it at weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. Now, a lot of wind is going to be moving through a large part of the Gulf Coast communities in the next couple days, and of course the Northwest. So let's take a look at this. Northerlies in the Lynn Canal, 30 knots with 6-foot seas, 4-foot seas through Stevens Passage, and a southeasterly flow into Clarence Strait, all around 20 to 30 knots or so tomorrow. And then offshore, we're looking at north and westerlies along the outer coast, and offshore winds pulling into low pressure across the central Gulf with westerlies across the northern Gulf. By Thursday, you can see the wind switching around a little bit more. We still have northerlies in the Lynn Canal with 4-foot seas, 3-foot seas through Clarence and Stevens Passage. South and westerly flow returns to the outer coast, though. Once again, as low pressure is approaching, you can see that we'll have a little bit of a different wind pattern here across the interior. That's a look at your Thursday map in southeast. For south central, northerlies around Prince William Sound, gusts up to 50 miles per hour outside of the Copper River Delta, 7-foot seas there, 8-foot seas down the coast toward Resurrection Bay, and north and westerly winds coming down Cook Inlet, stronger over the Barrens at 35 knots with 10 to 11-foot seas there on Wednesday. Still about the same level of intensity on Thursday, let's say, but you can see the winds coming up a little bit more across northern Cook Inlet. North and easterly flow, though, off the Kenai Peninsula, 8 to 11-foot seas. Northerlies inside of Prince William Sound, and an easterly flow cutting across the northern Gulf at 20 to 30 with 5 to 9-foot seas there on Thursday. Across Bristol Bay, southerlies at 35 knots with 7-foot seas. Much stronger winds down the coast out of the south and west, 45 knots with 15-foot seas there on Wednesday. 30-knot winds across the Pacific coast, 8 to 14-foot seas, and the bright red area indicates the highest seas in the central and eastern Bering. That moves east and south as we head into Thursday. Storm force winds down the Alaska Peninsula on either side, 60-knot winds there, 40-foot seas down the Bering Sea coast for the Alaska Peninsula, and 29-foot seas for the Pacific coast with 30 to 50 knots across the southern end of Kodiak Island. Northwesterlies up to 40 knots in Bristol Bay with 19-foot seas. Once again, storm force winds in the region, and a high wind watch is posted for the land areas of the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday. Once again, across the Bering Sea, you see the bright red center there across the central Bering. Those are the higher seas above 20 to 30 feet. Across the chain, south and westerlies 40 to 45 knots, 17-foot seas in some areas, north and westerlies 35 to 40 out across the west. As we get into Thursday, you can see quick improvement across the western chain, but northwesterly winds here 45 to 55 knots. Storm force winds once again across the eastern Aleutians north of Unalaska there and to the south, 20 to 21-foot seas, anywhere from 30 to 40-foot seas across the eastern chain for your Thursday. Across the west coast, once again, there's that bubble of higher seas. Southerlies across the west coast, 45 knots with 17 to 26-foot seas around the Pribilofs. North and easterly winds coming out of Norton Sound. Easterlies south of St. Lawrence Island to 45 knots. By Thursday, you can see those northwest winds really cutting in, 50 to 55 knots across the region, 22 to 26-foot seas across the region, and 34 knots with 55 knots with northwesterlies bringing 34-foot seas around the Pribilofs as we get into your Thursday. Let's take a look up north. Westerlies continuing across the Chukchi coast with the open water there. 30 to 35 knots with 8 to 15-foot seas over the ice. 20 knots from the east on Wednesday. North and westerly winds continue across the region on Thursday. 25 to 30 with 8 to 9-foot seas for the Chukchi coast. There are coastal flood advisories posted for many of our west coast communities down to the Yukon Delta as we go into tonight and early tomorrow. And blizzard warnings are continuing across many of our northwestern communities from the Brooks Range and the northern coast all the way down into Norton Sound and to the west through the Seward Peninsula. Strong winds and accumulating snow will be an issue. A high wind watch is posted for the Alaska Peninsula and winter weather advisories for the west, as well as coastal flood advisories for many of our coastal communities north of Bristol Bay all the way toward the Chukchi coast. A snow advisory has been posted for Juneau tomorrow starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, expecting 4 to 6 inches of snow there. Blizzard warnings will continue in the north and slowly taper off from west to east, only to be replaced by a stronger weather system out across the west with some heavy snow and wind initially across the region for the interior and quickly changing back over to rain before it becomes snow and much windier for the Alaska Peninsula as we head into Thursday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.